Hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us for a discussion on minimizing risk in code deployment. This is a lead dev webinar created in partnership with LaunchDarkly. This webinar will last roughly 45 minutes, after which both myself and the panelists will head on over to the lead dev Slack, and you can ask us some questions in the building software channel. So let's get started with some introductions. I'm Stevie Dieter. I'm a senior software engineer with the Providence Digital Innovation Group, where I'm a technical lead for DuxCare, a healthcare access optimization platform. Before DIG, I was a software engineering consultant for clients in a wide range of industries. I'm really excited to hear from our three amazing panelists. In alphabetical order, we have Jackie Balzer. Jackie is a senior engineering manager at Spotify, leading teams building podcast and talk audio experiences. Before Spotify, she led the front-end engineering team building the world's leading platform for showcasing and discovering creative work at Behance and Adobe. Based in London by way of NYC, she loves a good pub session, enjoys exploring and discovering new places, and spends a lot of time thinking about building empathetic engineering practices and processes. Next is William Hill. William is a senior software engineer at New Relic. He has worked as a full stack engineer and a DevOps engineer, writing tools for subject matter experts in non-proliferation, climate science, and basketball analytics. He has also worked as a proponent of increasing diversity in the computing field by recruiting and mentoring engineers from underrepresented groups. And Dawn Parzik. Dawn is a developer advocate at LaunchDarkly, where she uses her storytelling prowess to write and speak about the intersection of technology and psychology. She enjoys helping people be more successful at work and life. She makes technical information accessible, avoiding buzzwords and jargon wherever possible. Dawn has spoken at DevOps Days, Velocity, Interopt, and Monitorama. Her articles have appeared in numerous technical publications. In her free time, she serves as an organizer for Write Speak Code, the Seattle DevOps Meetup, and is on the organizing committee for DevOps Days Seattle. Pushing code to production more rapidly is the goal for most engineering teams, but pressure to maintain velocity comes with its own set of stressors. Time shortens and potential bugs slip through the net more quickly. Every deployment comes with its own amount of risk, but is risk always something to be feared? Sometimes, when I've read too many blog posts and too many ACM papers about software engineering practices, I feel overwhelmed. It seems like everybody else is working in some engineering nirvana, and they have perfect tooling that gets their code from the engineer's fingers to production with nary a hitch. But nobody starts with perfect risk management strategies, with all the tools, with all the processes. It can be very overwhelming. So my first question to the panel is, what's one thing everyone can do today to minimize risk in their code deployments? And I'd like to start with Jackie.
Yeah, I love this question. I wish I could give like a magic bullet quick solution, but I'll go with something a bit more practical and say, I would say like start by looking at what the most common problem or challenge is you're facing. And actually agree with your team that that is actually the most painful thing, because you don't want to invest in a solution that solves the wrong problem. But I think it's good to acknowledge with these things, like there's both a technical and a procedural component to these. So it's like, what's hurting you the most? Is it your tools or is it your process? So you could think about like, maybe your team is spending a lot of time gathered around on like a bi-weekly build night, trying to release, 2 weeks worth of code when your traffic is at the lowest. And that's how your form of minimizing the risk. So maybe that's a process problem. Or maybe it's something like your deployment script is this magical black box that only one person on your team knows how to operate. So in that case, maybe it's more of a tooling issue. Is there any low-hanging fruit when you look at your situation? Are there any like small, quick changes you can make that would have a disproportionately big impact? This could be something small like making smaller change sets. So I think inherently a smaller change set comes with less risk than a big one. Could be something like automating a test that frequently breaks, or even implementing like a user-friendly or abstraction layer over your deployment process. So I think my suggestion, first thing you do, look at what's most painful, what's hurting you the most, pick a quick win that'll get you to your ultimate eventual goal.
That sounds like something that can actually be achieved. Dawn, do you have any input on this?
Yeah, I think to add to what Jackie was saying, like the other piece to that is having the right people. And by the people, I mean, like you need people that are okay with failure, because you're going to take risks. It's going to result in failure. So you need people that are accepting of mistakes happening. So that means having an environment that's psychologically safe so that people can ask questions and they're not belittled or made to feel like they don't know what they're talking about when like they're asking questions. So the culture piece of it is a huge part of being able to minimize those risks. If you don't have an environment where people are comfortable taking risks, you're not going to be able to make any changes. Like even if you have like the right tools in place and you've identified the procedures, like people are hard. Like in some ways, technology is a lot easier than the people side of things. So like making sure that you have like that right environment for people is a very important part of this as well.
Yeah, very, very good. And William, do you have anything to share on this?
I think Jackie and Don nailed it. I guess the only thing I would potentially add is evaluating your metrics. Like, look at what you're measuring, because then a lot of times you can't evaluate what you don't measure. So if you can look at your metrics and kind of like Jackie mentioned, find what the lowest hanging fruit is. I think that is something you can do. So, because and that's not to trivialize, trivialize or demean like the metrics or instrumentation, because that stuff is not particularly easy all the time. But if you do have that in place, or even if you don't have it in place, look at what you're measuring and look at what you're not measuring. So that could be kind of like a first step of deciding, where you should go as far as, minimizing your risk.
Great. So I think we all know that failure is a very powerful teacher. So let's get down to brass tacks and talk about failures that we've learned from and that have taught us better risk management strategies. So William, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I have a particular horror story that I'll try to keep as brief as possible. But the very first time I was in like a leadership role is I moved to like the climate science research team at the research lab I was working at, and they had this open source tool that was distributed to scientists across the world. But at the time that I came to the team, the person who was like in the role before me, I think it was a dual role. They had one, and because the team was distributed, we had one person in the States and then one person in Europe. And the person in the States had left the company, and then the person in Europe was like away from work for like 6 months. So they couldn't release any software for like 6 months. So I had to come in and learn the process from how can I put this nicely? Not so great documentation. So I had to come in and learn the process, and it was very manual. It was very labor intensive, and then it was only one person knew how to do it. So it was a single point of failure. As I mentioned, the person was away, so they couldn't release software for 6 months. So the particular horror story, as if that's not bad enough, is it would take about 2 hours to go from building to like verifying that a deployment went out successfully. I can remember one time in particular, I was at the point of verification, that this deployment went out and it broke. It was because a developer forgot to close a bracket in an XML file. So that was an hour and 45 minutes down the drain. So it was just painful. That was like when I came in, and at the time, no one at the company had or in that particular team had spoken of like DevOps or CI/CD or any type of like actual process. It was all manual. So that's what geared me. I was like, okay, I got to make this better because this is just painful for me, where I'm losing a couple hours a day over a missed character. So that was like where I really started to look in, like, how can we automate this process and make it cleaner to minimize failures.
Yeah, you see me smiling because I think all of us have had similar experiences. Don, do you have any stories you want to share with us?
I think this is going back a number of years. I was on site deploying load balancing hardware, and I took I was doing an evaluation, so I took like a personal device with me to install and do a proof of concept with, and I didn't reset it to factory defaults before I brought it in, and I didn't pay attention to like what I had picked up, and so I picked up a device that had been configured to work as a DHCP server. In addition to other things, as soon as I plugged it into the customer's network, it started trying to like hand out IP addresses to everyone around, and brought a couple of people to like a standstill. I mean, it took me a very short period of time to figure that out, but as I quickly unplugged it and, took it offline and made the changes that needed to be changed. But like, it taught me that like, you always have to like double and triple check, right? Like it would have taken me, 10 minutes to look at it and like have a checklist before like going on site of like, have I done like A, B, C, and D before plugging something into like a live network to make sure that you're not going to bring somebody else's network down.
Awesome. And Jackie?
Yeah, everyone has a horror story. Mine goes back to sort of the early days of Behance as a small team. We were pretty scrappy back then, and the situation was that we were about to announce, I think it was like our first round of funding or something. And as part of that, we were going to have an article published on TechCrunch, which is really exciting for like a really small startup, kind of feel like you're making it big. So it was an exciting time when we were all kind of geared up in the office. It's like, going to go live at 2 p.m. And moments before it went live, we decided to add a feature to the Behance homepage that pulled in some of the articles from our blog just to try and drive a little bit of extra traffic. And I built it really quickly. I had someone review my code. We deployed it straight to production. The TechCrunch article went live and it immediately brought down Behance because there was a problem with the caching for our blog post stuff. So I was absolutely horrified. It was our big moment. You kind of only have a few minutes to really nail it when an article goes live. That was pretty devastating. And I think it was actually a good example of like, best laid plans don't always go the way you think. Like I said, we followed our process to a T. Maybe we skipped staging, but everything else was there. I think actually, if anything, our takeaway from that was a little more procedural. Maybe if we're going to make a high risk deployment in the last few moments before something important is going on, think about, what the benefits versus the risks are.
That's an awesome learning. And that takes me to my next question is, how do we make sure that we learn from our failures so that we don't make the same mistakes again? And how do we make sure we're minimizing risk without becoming unduly risk adverse? And Dawn, I know you have some thoughts on this.
I do. The more we talk about failure, the less like we reduce the stigma that's associated with it. So you need to be able to share like that you've made a mistake and own it, whether it's big or small. Like, and if you're like super averse to like, oh, but I can't like talk about the fact that I've made a mistake, start with something small. Get it on a daily basis. Like, I made a mistake. Like I burned my toast today, and get comfortable like with failures like that before you announce a failure. Like Jackie was just talking, like I released a feature that ended up crashing the website. Like that's a bigger failure and a mistake to own. So start small and like build up your tolerance for talking about things that don't go right. You need to put also like protections in place for like when you are going to take risks, because mistakes are going to happen. Like you can't stop failures no matter how much prep you do, follow all the procedures, dot all the I's, cross all the T's. Like there are going to be mistakes. So look at what procedures and what safety mechanisms that you can put in place to quickly recover when things fail. Not to be like, product pitch, but, I work for Launch Darkly. Our offering is around feature flags and feature management. So if you are launching like a feature and like there may be risk associated with it, put it behind a flag. If something fails, just turn that feature off as quickly as you can. So that way you're taking the risk, but you're minimizing the repercussions or the blast radius when things go wrong.
Awesome. William, do you have any more details?
Yeah, I'm a big fan of the retrospective that we do on my team, as far as, kind of trying to build a blameless culture. Because even at the beginning of the retrospective, we have a credo that we would read to kind of establish like, hey, and I can't remember it verbatim, but it's something to the effect of, hey, we all make mistakes, that, no one's above making a mistake. So we're coming into this as not as a, oh, this is your fault that this happened. This is like, okay, this is what happened, and this is how we can try to prevent it from happening in the future. So it's part of, really the culture driving the process. So we realize that we made a mistake. All right, let's document that mistake. Let's discuss it. and like how can we prevent this from happening in the future without guilt tripping anyone or doing a get blame or something like that.
Awesome. So one way to minimize risk is to plan for failure and how to respond. What are effective tools and exercises you have used to prepare for failures that have led to risk minimization? And Jackie, if you have any ideas on the previous topic or want to go straight into this one, that would be awesome.
Yeah, definitely. I think they're pretty closely related. So, this is something I think also very much a tool and a process component to it. I mean, first it starts by how you even know if a failure is happening. So, having monitoring and alerting in place, or at least, an easy way to access them, I think is a pretty key component to the whole equation. And then, once, let's say the failure has happened, I think one pretty good practice is to just try and undo the thing that's causing the problem as quick and seamlessly as possible. And then once the damage has been mitigated, then you can actually think about fixing the root cause. And then you can think about actually learning from that failure. You don't want to try and do too much in the heat of the moment. So I think this can mean a few different things. Like Dawn was saying, feature flags are a really awesome way to just be able to reduce the blast radius, turn something off super quickly if you see a problem. It could be something in how you do your version or source control. So maybe it's keeping a pristine branch so that you always have something healthy to build off of, or something that is in a stable state, something quickly to roll back to. It could also be something even more sophisticated, like maybe your traffic is off the charts because you made the homepage of Reddit and you just want to redirect or scale up so that you can handle the extra traffic. So it's sort of building in these things like responses to things that you can anticipate. But I think a really key piece of all of this actually is not just having these things at your disposal, but also having a central and easy to understand place where you can access all of these things and they can be as self-service as possible. So I think if someone feels ownership over this stuff and also empowered and that everything they need is at their fingertips, you create a way safer environment for someone to feel like they're actually in control. You don't want something to be on fire and you're frantically trying to figure out how to see the logs you need to see to figure out what's happening or anything like that. Oh, you muted.
So told you it would happen. Knowing the tools that you have and being able to access them is the part of the battle half the time. So Dawn, do you have any more ideas you want to put into this topic of learning, planning for failures and how to respond?
I think two, and maybe it's a related way of doing it, is testing in production, like using chaos days or game days to see what breaks how in a safer environment. There's a lot of research that talks about, play and gamifying things. And when it's a game, it's way more exciting. It's a different kind of exciting than when everything's broken, right? So it's in a safer way. And we learn from play. And so playing with our systems in an organized way, having a game day to say, okay, if we do this, what's going to happen with the systems? And it's done in a safe way where everybody knows that this is, a test. It's not real, but you look at what was the cascading effect, what happened, and then you can build procedures in place. So if you see that in production, you can quickly mitigate them through some of the ways that Jackie was talking about. So having that done in when the stakes are lower is a much better way to be able to learn and figure out how to handle it when your energy levels and your anxiety levels are lower. Because when your anxiety levels are higher, you're not going to be thinking as clearly as when you're oh, this is fun. Your brain does weird things. So make your brain think you're having fun solving a problem instead of, oh crap, I need to get this fixed now. And you'll figure out ways to get things fixed.
Absolutely. And William, do you have any additional thoughts?
Yeah, definitely want to echo what Don said about game days. I think those are super valuable. Before coming to New Relic, as I mentioned, I was at a government research laboratory, so it was a bit of a different environment. So once I kind of, got to New Relic and, had to deal with we never did a game day or anything like that at the previous place. But so once I got the New Relic, those game days were super, super valuable to me because like whenever an incident was come in or something like that, I would just be like a ball of stress, like, oh my God, oh my God, oh my God. Like everything's broken. What am I gonna do? What am I gonna do? But with those game days, it helps kind of build confidence where it was like, all right, something went wrong. Okay, step back, take a deep breath, and then follow the triage process. We have a very structured incident response process to kind of walk you through it and help you through it because yeah, I was just a ball of stress the first time I saw an incident come in whenever I was assigned to handle it. So those game days are really, really effective in my mind of just building the overall confidence within the team that you can handle whatever is thrown your way.
Awesome. So a lot of what we've been talking about throughout so far is how much that risk minimization isn't just when you're deploying to production, it's the entire software development lifecycle. So let's talk about what are things that we should be doing to build into the entire process so that we have minimized risk when we actually flip the switch and go to production. And is it sometimes more useful to actually focus more on the beginning of the process than worry so much about the end of it? So Don, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, I'm a fan of starting from the beginning instead of trying to retrofit and band-aid things after. And so that starts at the design phase. Like when you're building a feature, think about what safety mechanisms need to be put in place. Think about, do you want to run an experiment on the feature to figure out, like, is it going to behave the way you want it to? Do you need to put a feature flag on it for operational purposes? Like, do you know from your testing that this feature under heavy load is going to behave in some unknown ways? So do you want to put like some safety mechanisms in place so then if you see your load is increasing, that feature automatically turns off so that you're not dealing with some of these, challenges in like the middle of things. So if you start thinking about that from the beginning at like the design phase and the testing phase and like the experimentation phase, that's not really one of the phases, but like you should be experimenting all the time. So like that should be a phase. Those are definitely going to help you in the long run. So like start at the beginning and think about like all the little tiny steps between like, I have an idea and I'm deploying it into production.
Great advice there. Jackie, what insights do you have for us?
Yeah, I mean, +1 to everything that Don just said for sure. But I think there might also be a reality where sometimes you do need to, let's say, retrofit something that didn't get the attention that it deserved during creation. And so I think, again, it kind of goes back to like looking at what's the low-hanging fruit or what the quick wins are that you can maybe implement on the next thing that you do. Don't try and solve every problem all at once. But there's, I think, generally small improvements you can make adding on as you go along that can add up to a really big difference later on.
Awesome. And William?
Again, it's really just piggybacking off of what Don and Jackie said that you're going to have both situations. Sometimes you'll be able to, do a thorough design sprint and design mocks and write tests from the beginning, and sometimes you won't. I think too, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. If you have metrics, if you have any type of instrumentation or visibility or observability into your code base, so what are the most critical things? Like, what are the critical paths and what are things that are most heavily accessed? Because if you have like a lower risk feature, then sometimes, if it's not accessed as much or something like that, you may feel more comfortable doing a little bit, more of a risky deployment to modify that. But if you have like, say something that's tied to like your sign up button or your payment button, then you want to be very careful with, doing any type of things and modify that. So you also have to, have that understanding of how your users or your customers are interacting with your product so that you can kind of know what risk you can take.
Awesome. So to sort of build on that, based on your experiences as engineers, what is one tool or process that you didn't have when you first started, you've started using in the meantime, that you would insist is always available to you in any sort of major size project? The one thing that you're just like, we can't live without this. This is how I keep my life sane as a software engineer. Jackie, let's start.
Yeah, good question. I think this goes back to having like a clear centralized place to access all the tools and the resources that you need during your deployment. So I've had this at a couple of companies now. At Behance, we built our own internal CI/CD like pipeline and UI that made it super easy, very user-friendly to deploy your code. And similarly at Spotify, we have a tool called Backstage, which we've actually recently open sourced. And it's meant to be like a developer portal. And so again, it goes back to like having your tools at your fingertips and easily accessible and easily understandable is a total game changer. When you're trying to like operate something that maybe it could be a low risk deploy, maybe it is a high risk one, you want to be confident in what you're actually dealing with. And if that information or the tools and resources you need are obfuscated, you're going to lack confidence. And that could actually increase the risk of things going wrong. So any tool that, you know, collects the information that you need, makes it easily accessible. That could be dashboards. It could, honestly, it could be documentation, the status of your build, easy access to previous builds. All of that stuff together is super, super key for me.
And William, is there one tool that you would never live without again?
If you would have asked me this a few years ago, I would have said any tool. Like as I mentioned, like the horror story that I told earlier, we had virtually no tooling. It was all done manually. Our code was hosted on GitHub, but we were not even using GitHub issues to track bugs. It was just all ad hoc over email, which caused a whole lot of pain for me. So that's what I would have said, like just any tool several years ago. But now, just a really nice functional test suite, so that then you can have a nice CI/CD pipeline. But then feature flags is something I think, you know, is a huge thing now, because that's a really good way to minimize risk, where you can kind of have your percentage of like, are we going to release it to 10% of customers, or 20%? You can and then as you start to get more customer feedback, you can then steadily increase the number, and until you do the full deployment to all available customers. So I think that's a huge thing that going forward I would not want to live without.
Awesome. I find it interesting that some of these tools that we talk about are actually sometimes thought about things for experimentation, or actually things that help us minimize risk. That experimenting is risky, but it can be done in a risk minimizing way, or actually to help the overall process. Don, do you have any thoughts to add to that?
Well, and not just because William was saying like use feature flags, like I'm throwing it back to him. Like I think monitoring and observability tools are so important from like the risk mitigation standpoint of, you need to know when things are breaking. You need to know when you're getting early warning signs that something may not be right. So having the correct observability and monitoring, logging, analytics, that stuff is so important to help figure out like what's going on. And then those tools need to integrate with your CI/CD pipeline and your feature flagging. So like you want the ability to have an alert come in from like a monitoring system, and that automatically triggers a chain of events. So like you don't have to touch anything, but like, okay, I've got an alert, like the flag's been turned off. I've set a notification into the Slack, and people are now working on it. So you're reducing that human interaction of what's necessary to stop something from going wrong, because you've gotten all of the data and automation into it. So I think that monitoring and observability piece is such a huge thing when you're looking at, risks associated with deploying software.
That actually takes me right to my next question, which is that as engineers, it's really easy for us to focus on technical solutions to avoid risk, the sort of automation that you were talking about. But so many of the risk factors we've been talking about are non-technical, because in the end, we're all humans. So what are some examples of non-technical risks that we need to recognize, and how can we minimize them? I'll start with William on this one.
I think, just having buy-in from everyone on the particular process. Again, I'll reference back to, the horror story again, because it's the gift that keeps giving, as far as keeping me up at night. But it, we just the process, because whenever I first came to the team, all of the communication, about the code base was done over email, and it was really easy for things to get lost in the wash. Just because you get inundated with so many emails throughout the day and things like that. So, issue that came up last week may not be addressed for who knows when because it slipped through the cracks. So, having buy-in from everyone on the particular process that you want to do, when one, with planning out features, but then also whenever things arise within production or something. So, how do you respond to that? So, having a strong bug tracking system, having strong buy-in with just the engineering standards, which I know that kind of then leads back into the technical side, but making sure that everyone buys in, like, okay, this is how we're gonna plan out the next sprint. This is how we're gonna plan out the deployment. This is okay. Do we have blockers? How do we handle whenever we're blocked? So just having processes in place and having buy-in, where the whole team is there, and then having these things documented, so that people can go back and reference it. Because I mean, you're inevitably going to forget things. Whether you're onboarding someone who's new, or if you've been there for a while and you just forget how something is handled. So having that buy-in and documentation, I think, are two kind of non-technical things that could be really important.
Awesome there. Jackie, what about you?
Yeah, I would 100% agree. Like, maybe to just emphasize that point, the non-technical components here are like communication and alignment on like, what is the plan? What is the process? What do you do and who will do it when something goes wrong? And a lot of times I think that looks like it could be an on-call rotation and things like that. But if there's no clarity around that, if there's a lack of communication, maybe no one's picking up a dropped ball, or maybe two people are doing it, too many people are, and now they're conflicting and causing even more problems. To share another horror story, we actually had a time once where, like, if you want to talk about a non-technical problem, but our data center was literally on fire, gives actually a whole new meaning to something being on fire. And like, that's a kind of non-technical thing. How do you prepare for that? I don't know. Maybe there's an extreme where you don't. But I think, that's when the people aspect really comes into play, because the way that we overcame that is from constant communication, being very active, staying in touch, coming up with a plan and communicating it really clearly. Without that, who knows what would have happened.
Awesome. And Don, I know you have some thoughts on this topic.
Yeah, I'm going to focus more on the people side of things on this. Making sure like your team is appropriately staffed, making sure people aren't burning out, making sure people are taking time off, and not encouraging the person that's on time off but still responding to support issues when they log in. No, like, when people take time off, that should be like disable Slack, turn off email. Like, if you're still plugged into work, that's not giving your body and your brain a chance to rest and recharge. And then that leads to like more burnout and like medical issues and mental health issues. And none of that's good. So making sure that you have the right, again, like, look at this environment. You have the right environment where you encourage people to take time off. If somebody says that they're feeling overworked and overwhelmed, that you listen to them and you figure out like, what can you do to lessen the load on them? So many times people raise their hands and say like, okay, I can't do this. I've got too much. And it's just like, I'll just power through like 1 more week, 2 more weeks. And it's like, no, if somebody raises their hand and says like, help me, you need to help them, because if that person burns out, then the chances are more people on the team are going to burn out because they're doing less. And so other people are going to start doing more. So encourage people to take time off. And I know in like these times, it's really hard. People are like, where am I going to go on vacation? Like, you don't have to go on vacation. Just like turn off your computer for a week. go for a walk around like your neighborhood, binge watch your favorite television show, whatever. Like just don't do something work related. Like your brain needs that separation between like work and not work.
Yeah, absolutely. When I take days off, I literally log out of Slack on my phone, and I do all of those things to make sure that people know that that's not. And it's really true on the burnout is, really focusing on the risk minimization is if somebody says now in the moment, today, day-to-day work, I'm feeling a little tired. That person is going to be stressed beyond the max if some sort of crisis happens. So we definitely need to make sure that we're setting people up to succeed in those areas as well, is my opinion.
Yeah, and if I could quickly
yeah, absolutely.
quickly piggyback off what Don said, I think she's absolutely right. And I think, kind of another part with that is along with the processes and stuff, having where you're able to have knowledge sharing sessions, because then you reduce the risk of having like a single point of failure. So, if something happens that one person doesn't feel entirely responsible, because that can lead them to burnout if they're, feel like they're the single point of responsibility for this, where they always have to be there in case something goes wrong. So, because sometimes, and I've had this happen, even when I'm taking time off, I'm still in the back of my head like, oh my gosh, what is like, because I had another horror story where I was at a conference and I get like pinged by my team that's like the deployment didn't go out right, and I was like, oh great, no one else knows how to do it, so I had to like leave the conference floor to go back to my hotel to kind of do it. So even when I was away from work, it was still on my mind. So by having that knowledge shared across the team, it can help, just lessen the burden on everyone.
So that leads to a good question of how can we build in risk minimization from the start? Is there a checklist of things that we should all do from our very first PR on our new service? Jackie, what do you think?
This is a tough one because I think it depends very much on what it is you're building and what your end goal is. But, going back to an answer from before, I think there's always some low-hanging fruit, some foundational stuff that you can always start with. And it's both process things and tooling. What are the smallest like lint checks or style checks that you can put in place at the beginning? But more importantly, what are the processes? How do you build alignment with your team, get everyone started on the very same page about what the expectations are and how things are actually going to work?
And Don, do you have any ideas on this?
My favorite answer, and it drives people nuts, like, it depends. Like, we're all on this search for best practices. Like, I want to hear like what worked for other people, and then I'm going to completely lift what worked here and move it over here. And that doesn't work because the people are different, the tools are different, the process, like everything is different. So we're all looking for like these best practices and like, tell me what to do. And it's like, I can't tell you what to do. I mean, there's some things I can tell you to do, but you need to figure out what's going to work with the people that you have, the resources that you have in terms of like tooling and time and budget, and, figure out that list kind of for yourself and start small. Like, as Jacob said, like, don't try to be like, okay, I have to totally reinvent things. I have to like do like CI/CD, and like if that's not something you're already doing, like start with baby steps and slowly build up to something that works and it's repeatable and it leads to success.
Awesome. And I'll ask William the same question in just a second, but just want to remind the audience watching, if you have any questions, please feel free to submit them. We'll have some time to get to them in just shortly. So Will, are there any particular things that you would build in from day one should be in that first PR or that first design review?
Yeah, the probably a super unpopular answer would be to do test-driven development from the start. So, but most of us don't like writing tests, even though it's probably the most beneficial thing. But I think a small thing you could potentially do, and it kind of goes back to engineering standards, is just decide like, okay, we're gonna use, say, if you're working on front end code or whatever code you're working in, we're gonna use this linter and this code formatter. We're going to use, say if you're working on the front end, and we're going to use Prettier. and then just have a .pretty or RC file that goes into the code base so that anyone who clones it then, has the same prettier configuration. The same thing for like ESLint. Have your ESLint config file where then whoever, clones this and works on it for the future, especially if they, just take a few minutes to set up the bindings in their whatever IDE they're using. Hopefully they're using something like not like Vim or anything. Sorry, I probably just made some people mad. Sorry about that. But so have those integrations into their IDE or whatever they're using, so that then you have consistent code formatting. So that can be just one thing you can do to minimize risk. And then this is more of a process thing, but what we've done recently, which has been pretty successful, is right before release is doing a bug bash, where you just write out all of the user stories that should happen within the application, and then we all just get together, obviously virtually now, and just walk through the stories, and then we actually go through the story, and if people find things, then you bring them up right then and there. So that's more of a process thing, but that's something that can be done from the start as well.
Yeah, we use bug bashes pretty frequently. In fact, that's considered to be one of the gates for most of our big features for exactly that reason. And it's just so powerful to really shake out those weird edge cases, because as developers, we know how to do the happy path. And it's also great for, I think, good thing in the risk minimization concept of it's really helpful to sort of let the devs see how to do QA type work, because I know I don't always think like a tester, and our bug bashes are generally led by our QA team, and I've learned so much about how to figure out how to test all these edge cases. So that's been really powerful as well as part of an overall tool in the process.
Can I add one thing to that?
Oh, absolutely.
Comment is, if you're doing them, involve non-engineering and non-test in them, because sometimes like users do strange things with their software. So having somebody that isn't familiar with how the software works or is going to use it in a different way can reveal some bugs that you didn't know were in there, because like I said, that happy path, and I'm going to do A, B, C, and D. But what happens if you do A, B, F, Q? What happens then? So involve other people outside of the engineering organization in your bug bashes.
Yeah, absolutely. What happens if you're writing a video conference software and you never test that? What happens when the user doesn't accept to share their video? So I wanted to sort of piggyback off Will's point about, some people don't want to do TDD because they think it slows them down, topics like that. So how do you make sure that your risk minimization strategies don't slow you down? Is there any point that's too soon to do something? How do you make the choice of that risk benefit analysis? So Jackie, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I think it is an analysis. It's always weighing the issues. I saw the question using the phrase, you aren't going to need it. That's a favorite of mine. And I think it is a fair strategy to don't solve a problem before you have it. And if you start having it, figure out what's the impact of that problem, how serious is it, and how often is it occurring. I think you might solve, like I said before, don't solve a problem if you don't have it, and you don't want to be solving the wrong problem either. So I think I think development and engineering in general is constant weighing of the trade-offs, and what are you optimizing for? If you're optimizing for a 0% downtime, 0 bug, 0 failures system, then you will probably come up with different solutions than if you're just optimizing for, let's say, speed of release of features. So there's always trade-offs, and it's always weighing and measuring them, and just aligning and agreeing with your team on what you're optimizing for.
And Will, any thoughts you have on that?
Yeah, I definitely think it's a balancing act. I can just speak to a more recent experience where my team decided to implement A-to-E testing, and it was, product was already out, so it was one of those things we were kind of retrofitting, but we felt we needed, just because we're getting more like bug like reports or whatever. It's like finding bug edge cases and bugs within our UI. So we want to do ET testing, and it sounded great, initially, and it was. But once we added it to our PR build pipeline, it added like significant amount of time to the build process. So it increased our build times. And then also we were getting flaky tests, and it was difficult sometimes because sometimes the tests were failing and it was like, oh, this is actually a legitimate problem. But then other times tests were failing just because like the server timed out or something like that. So, or just, we're testing across multiple versions of multiple browsers, and then you would have just, flaky stuff that happened with browsers. So it was a balancing act of like, okay, we're trying to make sure, we're increasing reliability and we're reducing risk, but then also it is slowing down our velocity a bit because of one, just the increased build times, and also just sometimes general flakiness. So we had to kind of balance of like what is good enough, for now, as we're still working to improve reliability at all times, but we also want to still move fast. So we just had to really walk that line of saying like what is the most important features that we can test in PRs, and then also can we then extract like the full test suite into something that just runs periodically, so then we cover both our bases, that we get fast builds but then also really reliable coverage of our test.
Awesome. And Don?
I think when we're moving in this way, one thing to keep an eye on is the accumulation of technical debt. So you can move really quickly, right? So it's like, okay, what's that MVP? Like, what do we need to get the bare minimum of this feature out? And like, we'll go and fix these things later. How many times do you really go back and fix those things at a later date? So schedule a time on a quarterly basis where like you're doing a sprint and it's dedicated to tech debt. Right. And the timing may be different. I'm going to tell you, like, it has to be on a quarterly basis. Like, again, like what works for your organization, but take a time to focus on that tech debt and get it resolved. So it's like, nobody likes working on it, but it needs to get done. And if you take care of it on a regular basis, it doesn't accumulate and lead to like larger problems down the road. And it allows you to move quickly when you want to, and then like take that break and like, okay, let's fix these things that need fixing. You're muted still, Stevie.
Again, we have a question from the web. So it's easy to roll back bad deployments on the web, but for mobile, it's a different story. Sometimes bugs slip into production apps. How to minimize this? Any ideas on how we deal with places where once it's out in the wild, it's out in the wild and it's really hard to take back?
I think I can start on this one. I think in this situation, and it is a really good point, sometimes when you work in web, you can take for granted how easy it is to roll back something quickly. When it comes to software applications, I think that is when you might take a different approach, and you might invest more heavily into a more comprehensive test suite, including end-to-end, and a more comprehensive process with your team around manual testing and confirmation that tests are actually passing. You might invest in spending more time on things like bug bashes and building an infrastructure that like supports all of that as well. Because yeah, it's a good point. Once something is out in the world, especially for something like an iPhone app, it's out there on that version forever. And sometimes you're also constrained on how fast you can even get the next release out. And so you do have to, I think that's again, when it comes back to weighing the trade-offs, on the web, maybe you can afford to take bigger risks and move a little bit faster because the cost of taking something back is pretty low. And it's not like that in software apps.
William, do you have any experiences with this?
Not really. So I don't probably have anything for you to add on that.
And what about Don? We deal a lot with having both mobile and web versions of our apps going out, and the nail biter sometimes when you're waiting for that Apple Store approval to come through on the bug fix version can be very stressful. So another question from the web is, how do you balance testing and writing tests with getting features out fast and keeping deadlines?
I can
Don,
try.
do you want to start?
Yeah, I can take a stab at this. I think it goes back to starting from that design phase, right? If you start thinking about what's needed when you start designing a feature, testing should be part of that, right? So as you're designing the feature, as you're building, like, what are the test cases that need to be done? It shouldn't be, okay, I built all this stuff and now it's going to go into test. That testing should be done while that feature is being designed and built. So they shouldn't be seen as two separate things. If you do them together, you shorten your time frame.
Yeah, I can add to that. That's similar to how like practices that we use at Spotify, where during the design phase or very, very early in the implementation phase, one step of the whole process is that we actually write requirements for what this feature entails. I think there's a couple benefits there. One is that it helps the engineers know what test coverage they'll need as they're building the feature out. But it also has the benefit of helping them, kind of going back to the thing about user testing and, you know, taking yourself out of the happy path. I think it helps set a foundation for thinking about all of those other non-happy path situations, so that not only do you cover them in your automated tests, but when you're taking yourself out of your engineering mindset and using it as an actual user, you're kind of better prepared to stray off of that happy path.
Yeah, so totally agree with both points. We do some of like a similar process with our MMF process, so minimum marketable features, where a test plan is part of that process of planning out our features. And also we don't adhere to this, I would say 100%, but you're supposed to have a unit test for whatever code, whatever feature you push for our code base, because once you create a PR, there's like a template, part of the template that says, okay, how do you test? It says, one, what test did you write for this? And then how do you test this manually if applicable? So we really try to put that as part of the process.
Awesome. Thanks to all the panel for some really great insights, really focusing on sort of the human element of how we can minimize risk and deploy more confidently to throughout our entire pipeline. With that, we are going to go ahead and head on over to the Slack channel, deploying software channel. We'll be hanging out there if people have some additional questions they want to ask. I think there was one or two that we didn't have time to answer in the actual panel. Thanks everybody who tuned in and listening. I hope you're able to take some great thoughts away from this. I know I'm really excited to get back to my team and share some of this. So see you guys in the Slack channel, and thanks so much for all of your help.